What's up, game roomies? Mustafa here. I hope you've all had an excellent summer, and I'm very excited to dive headfirst into a brand new campaign. This is going to be a short series of 5 videos. Every year I make it a priority with my summer to finish 5 games I've never beaten before, as a way of staying on the up and up with new trends and design philosophies in the industry. I've been at this for about 10 years now, but this year, for the very first time, I'm going to be doing a video review for each and every game I complete as part of this campaign. The last 2 years of this have been exceptional gaming experiences for me, allowing me to experience the heights of series like Persona for the very first time, or playing Paper Mario at a brand new light with the Origami King, or even experiencing some interesting design choices from indie platformers like Guacamelee 2, and some of the greater gaming experiences of my career. This year, I've already completed the 5 games and plan on doing full reviews for the channel of each of them, and I'm very excited to debut this with our kickoff title. Certainly a game I've got mixed feelings on, but I'd say perhaps in the best of ways. Seldom do we encounter anything more controversial than the ending. It rattles the cages of our souls to have to say goodbye, whatever shape it may take. The Yakuza series is no different. After all, following Yakuza 6, the original run of the series comes to a close, with future installments serving as a massive change in direction, kicking off with Yakuza Like a Dragon. While Yakuza 6, The Song of Life, sticks the landing in a great many ways, in other equally important ways it fails to capture what has been to this point the true essence of the series, resulting in what can at times feel like a lukewarm tribute, and while it is very fun to play, it does ring a bit hollow when measured against its contemporaries within the series. Now, that may sound a bit harsh, and certainly a game this divisive is a hell of a way to introduce Yakuza to this channel. However, you have to consider, this series has achieved some incredible heights, and it's because of those heights that I feel comfortable measuring it at such a high standard. To deduce why Yakuza 6 chooses to make so many changes is elementary. I mean, after all, consider that it's the 7th installment in a series that spanned decades, and certain elements were starting to grow predictable, at least depending on who you ask. I personally thought hunting a bear in the mountains and playing an Osaka idol simulator was a pretty solid subversion of the series up to that point, but hey, maybe that's just me. Yakuza 6, on the other hand, decides to rebuild Kamurocho from the ground up, this time introducing the shiny new Dragon engine. An unfortunate side effect to the remakes and remasters out there is that if you're playing these games chronologically, at least narratively speaking, you have already seen this engine used to better effect in Yakuza Kiwami 2, a remake of Yakuza 2. That said, if you take this game for what it is, especially experiencing it off the heels of the remastered trilogy, you'll find this engine to be a massive overhaul of the game. And coming fresh off the heels of Yakuza 0, which in my opinion was the game's original structure fully realized, it makes sense that there is nowhere left to go but up. The Dragon engine trades in the loading screens and detailed segmented areas for a much more fully integrated open world. You can walk from the Millennium Tower to the inside of Mock Mole and then to the convenience store without skipping a beat. In that way, the world feels like the devs have finally realized their full ambitions and the maximum potential of what this series is capable of. It feels like the final stage of that very first Yakuza game so long ago, and in that way it does feel like a fitting culminating point of the series. I would say if you've been watching my videos up to this point, you probably are well aware of what I value in a game, so I'll mostly be discussing the factors that I consider to be make or break. Obviously, game feel will always be core to my philosophy as a designer myself, but this is Yakuza we're talking about. Be it combat, exploration, or minigames, I like games that feel immersive, fun, easy and intuitive to control, and just like every other game in the series, except 3, Yakuza 6 nails this. Navigating Kamurocho feels the best it's ever felt, and unsurprisingly, the city itself has plenty to do this time around as well. Be it karaoke, Virtua Fighter and Club Sega, shogi, fighting in the Colosseums, fishing, this series reminds us what it means to care about what you're doing. One thing I've always respected about Yakuza is that where most games would put a cutscene, this series puts a minigame. Even the simpler tasks like calming a crying baby or triggering an explosive stays immersive and interactive the entire way through. The only breaks in action are for the story content, which as always is presented beautifully, and even more so thanks to the enhanced visuals this game offers. The jump to Kiwami 2 after playing 0 and Kiwami was amazing, but after running through the remastered trilogy and playing 3, 4, and 5 pretty close to their original visual style, Yakuza 6 is a breath of fresh air in that way. Not to mention that the Dragon engine is one of the most well optimized I've seen in this industry. It works in visual tricks and lighting well beyond what my hardware, playing on an Xbox One in this case, should be capable of. The smooth 60 FPS that the other games in the series were able to achieve is certainly absent here on this console at least, but for those who can experience it on newer hardware, I'm sure you'll find it to run fairly well without skipping a beat, and still remaining very visually impressive. The pacing has been ramped up quite a bit since last time, and with good reason, of course. This is the 7th installment of the series, all the more reason I'm not giving you a basic overview of Yakuza. At this stage, you're probably fairly well familiar with what this series has to offer. You know Kamurocho, and you've been there enough times for it to feel like a second home to you. The combat is new, sure, but it's simpler now than it's ever been, and the staples like light hits, heavy hits, grabs and throws, and weapon use are back in full swing. I do have to say that while certain efforts have been made to improve game feel, such as the addition of a full physics engine to manipulate character movement, the combat does lack some of the depth that the quad-style focus of the previous 2 installments introduced. In addition to this, the array of protagonists from Yakuza 4, 5, and 0 have all been removed, and you'll be playing as Kiryu for the entirety of this game. This isn't a problem on its own, and certainly helps with making the narrative feel far more intimate, but compounded with the lack of different fighting styles, you'll notice combat at times can start to feel a bit samey. In spite of this, battles do feel somewhat closer to real street fights than in previous games, and the natural evolution of concepts like Extreme Heat Mode from Yakuza 5 help to make combat fun and engaging all the way through. Of course, while all of this is fine and well, it's not Yakuza if you're not talking about the incredibly impressive stories that these games utilize. Yakuza 4's certainly wasn't the most sound, but for me at least, it was an absolute blast all the way through. Yakuza 5's story was complicated, but had a mostly satisfying culmination, and the coolest final battle segment the series has seen so far. But after all of that, where else do you go? Well, Yakuza 6 had an answer, and it certainly wasn't the one I think any of us were expecting. It chose to scale its narrative back, and a great deal as well. In doing so, it created something more intimate and even more character-driven than its predecessors. Yakuza 6, The Song of Life, has a story with a lot of heart, and that means the world to me. Underneath the hard shell of its crime families and their disturbing politics, Yakuza has always had this gooey emotional center. Kiryu, in particular, has always found motivation in ways you wouldn't expect from a reformed gangster, be it his relationship with Haruka, his orphanage, his super awesome girlfriend that they benched after one title, still bitter about that, or his friendships with the likes of Majima, Akiyama, Daigo, and even Nishiki. Those dynamics reached a boiling point in 5, so to have a sort of quieter approach to the series' climax is fascinating, and has depth in ways you might not otherwise expect. As I mentioned, to Kiryu, one of the most important relationships is the one that he shares with Haruka, and his journey to find some answers about the changes in her life takes up the crux of this game's story. This quest will have him going back and forth between 2 different locations, the first and familiar being Kamurocho, the city you've come to know and love. This time, it's plagued by a gang war unlike anything we've ever seen. And I know that phrase is thrown around quite a bit, but I'm not just saying that. The city has genuinely been changed, and even though it was never really a safe place to be, it's a straight-up war zone in this game. A war between the triads and the Tojo have rendered the city unsafe for anyone who won't yield to the power of the new Little Asia. In addition to this, new anti-crime laws have rendered the old Yakuza ways useless, inhibiting the ability for Daigo, Majima, and Saejima to get involved. In fact, all three are sent to prison during the scuffle. Now Kiryu is alone in a world he barely recognizes. Well, almost alone. You'll still have certain trusty allies like Akiyama and Date to help, and Kiryu even makes some new friends on a journey to Hiroshima. Guess you can teach an old dog new tricks after all. The story introduces some fun villains, including one who ranks pretty highly for me overall, but it fails to reach the heights of earlier villains in the series, like Kuze and Ryuji Goda. That said, one strength that this narrative does have is that each set of opponents feels like a culmination of Kiryu's journey. He'll be fighting factions that cover different facets of his past, converging to create an ultimate celebration of his battles. His battles feel adequately represented across the game, but that's just it. Yakuza has always been about more than just the fighting. A celebration of Kiryu's many wars falls flat if his closest relationships are not also celebrated with the same reverence. In that way, the game's choice to bench key players from the series like the florist, Daigo, Majima, or Saejima only serves to distance us further from what we love about the series, and as a result of that, Kamurocho ends up feeling a lot emptier in spite of its interconnected layout. Add this to the fact that Onomichi, the location in Hiroshima that Kiryu spends a lot of time in, feels a lot more boring than other secondary locations we've seen in the series, and adventuring overall just doesn't feel quite as good as it used to. The story feels more like a series of chores connecting the plot points, rather than the bombastic adventures we've come to know and love. I know these things together make it sound like I don't like the game, and compared to some of the others in the series, I honestly do consider it to be a weaker entry. But even still, I absolutely feel like it's worth playing, because of what it does get right. Yakuza 6 has one major strength over a lot of other games in the series, and that is its incredible character writing. From the new Yakuza you meet in Onomichi to the snakes in the Tojo's upper echelons, and even a now much older Haruka, the story feels very mature here in a way that I haven't felt in the series since playing Zero the first time. That isn't to say that it's the best story in the series, because it absolutely drags at times, just that it handles itself with a sort of cinematic gravitas that the series has always aimed for, but only really ever hit at its absolute peaks. All in all, it's a trade-off, and one that landed a bit clumsily, but that still offers a degree of heartfelt depth that we've come to love from the Yakuza Saga. To revisit some of what I had touched on earlier, I know I've mentioned aspects of the game's presentation, but in truth, I've barely scratched the surface. The lighting in this game is gorgeous, character models are incredibly detailed, music is great, and the overall design of the landscapes is just awesome. I mean, the way Kiryu kind of ramps up into a jog before he starts to run is one of the best examples I can think of the sheer attention to detail that they put into everything in this game. It makes places that we've been before, like the Millennium Tower, feel brand new all over again, which is great because it prevents us from getting sick of things that are repeated from previous games. I had mentioned earlier that Onomichi, the game's second primary location, is really boring, and I stand by that, but there is a temple area in the game that feels very out of place in the best way. It has this sense of history that the rest of the series doesn't ever really focus on. Not a fault to the series, its contemporary essence contributes to some of its heaviest storytelling choices, but at the same time, given the ties of this specific narrative to Japan and China's own history and tensions with one another, it's nice to see some older architecture to kind of complement some of those details. As always, the climaxes to individual chapters are incredibly strong in their execution, so once again I'd have to give kudos to the brilliant team for creating fun battles throughout Kamurocho and Onomichi. The climax battles are back in full swing, whether you're sifting through the wreckage of Shangri-La from the first game, fighting through, you guessed it, the Millennium Tower, or smashing your way through the eateries of Little Asia, you'll feel fully immersed in these large-scale wars between parties. Again, at times, the combat can feel a little bit simple, but I feel like that's at its least noticeable while you're experiencing the very clear game loop of these climax battles. This is also offset by an incredible physics engine and the ability to leverage your surroundings in ways you just couldn't in previous games. I do feel that it's critical at this point to point out there are facets of this narrative that are essential for anyone playing these games in order. I know a lot of people these days are suggesting starting with Like a Dragon, and to be fair, I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know if there are details that I'm missing, but I feel like if you're drawn to these games for their narrative, Yakuza 6 is the apex of the heart that these stories are known for. As you can see, there's a lot to the game, and as a result of that, certain qualities get weighed down, either by ideas not being fully fleshed out, or too much downtime between different facets of the narrative. This conclusion to the first Yakuza Saga tries to set up most of its moving pieces within the same installment. If this game had been smack dab in the middle of the series, that might have worked out, but as the culmination of these massive sprawling narratives, so much feels too new to really feel like that celebration of the series. And that's interesting, considering that the predecessor, Yakuza 0, was kind of that tribute in a lot of ways. But that's a story for another day. Separating what it represents from an ultimately critical look at the game based on my experience with it, Yakuza 6 has a solid story, but not a standout one. Good combat, but not quite at the heights of Zero or Kiwami. The presentation is unparalleled, with solid music, and as always, the character writing is very strong. There's no way I could tell you not to play this game because it's so important to the roadmap of this series. But I do have to warn you that as Yakuza is concerned, this is about as middle of the road as these titles get. Thank you all for tuning in for my review of Yakuza 6, The Song of Life, the first of my fabulous Summer 5. A little harsh, I realize, but I'm about halfway through Like a Dragon at this point, and they seem to correct course big time, so don't worry. Next on the list is a game that asks and answers some of the biggest questions in game design, so thanks again for watching, and you'll absolutely want to come back soon for more from The Game Room.